The strange thing about kindness is that you never know who is watching when you give it away. On the coldest night of that winter, Margaret Collins sat alone on a frozen park bench in downtown Chicago, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as the wind pushed through the empty streets like a restless tide. The digital clock on the bank across the road blinked 9:42 p.m., and the temperature sign just beneath it glowed an unforgiving 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Most people had already rushed home hours ago, escaping into warm living rooms and bright kitchens, but Margaret had never been in a hurry these days. At 68 years old, the world had grown quiet around her in ways she never expected. For 40 years she had been an elementary school teacher who rarely sat still for even 5 minutes, guiding generations of children through spelling tests, field trips, and science fairs. But retirement had turned the days into long stretches of silence broken only by the sound of the small radio in her kitchen and the hum of buses outside her apartment building. Tonight she had taken her usual evening walk through Grant Park, something her doctor said was good for circulation, though she suspected it was really just her way of remembering that the city still existed around her. Snow from the afternoon storm had hardened into thin sheets of ice along the sidewalk, and the wooden bench beneath her felt like a block of stone through her coat. Still, she stayed seated, her breath drifting into the air in pale clouds as she watched the nearly empty park. Margaret wore the one pair of winter boots she trusted during Chicago winters, thick brown leather lined with wool that her late husband, Robert, had bought for her nearly a decade earlier after she slipped on ice outside their old house. She remembered laughing at the time, telling him the boots were tougher than anything she needed. But tonight they were the only reason her feet weren't numb. Across the bench, at the far end beneath a flickering street lamp, someone suddenly sat down with a slow, careful movement that caught her attention. The man looked to be in his late 50s or early 60s, though it was hard to tell beneath the dim light. His coat was thin, the kind someone might wear in early fall, not in the middle of a Midwest winter, and his shoes looked worn enough that Margaret could see the edges separating from the soles. He rubbed his hands together and exhaled into them, trying to warm his fingers, but the wind stole the heat almost instantly. For a moment Margaret simply watched him, unsure whether to speak. People in cities learned to mind their own business, and she had spent years teaching her students that strangers deserve caution. Yet something about the way the man sat there quietly, shoulders hunched against the cold, reminded her of a lonely photograph she once saw in a history book. Someone waiting in a place the world had forgotten. The wind blew harder, rattling the bare branches overhead, and Margaret noticed the man's foot tapping against the frozen pavement as if he could no longer feel his toes. She glanced down at her own boots, sturdy and warm, then back at the stranger again. In that moment she had no idea that the small decision forming in her mind would echo far beyond that empty winter bench, or that the quiet man shivering 10 feet away was not who he appeared to be at all. Margaret had always believed that life slowly reveals who people truly are, not through grand moments, but through quiet years that pass without anyone paying attention. And as she sat on that frozen bench with the wind brushing past her face, she found her thoughts drifting backward through the decades that had shaped the woman she had become, because there was a time when her evenings were never silent, and her world felt much larger than the empty park in front of her. For 40 years she had worked at a small public elementary school on the north side of Chicago where the hallways always smelled faintly of pencil shavings and floor polish, and where children filled every corner with laughter and endless questions. Margaret Collins had been the kind of teacher who stayed late after the final bell helping students finish their reading assignments or calm their nerves before a spelling test, and every June, when another class graduated to middle school, she promised herself she would slow down the following year, but she never did. Her husband Robert used to joke that she cared about the neighborhood children almost as much as she cared about him, but he always said it with a warm smile as he poured 2 cups of coffee in their small kitchen every morning before work. They had lived for more than 30 years in a modest brick house on a quiet street, where maple trees lined the sidewalks and neighbors still waved when they passed each other on evening walks. After Robert passed away from a sudden illness nearly 8 years earlier, the house felt too large for one person, and the silence inside it felt heavier than the winter wind outside, so Margaret eventually sold it and moved into a smaller apartment building downtown where the rent was manageable with her teacher pension. Her son Michael lived in Colorado now with his own family, And although they spoke on the phone every couple of weeks, she understood that life moved quickly for younger generations, and she never wanted to become a burden that slowed them down. Most days, she kept a simple routine that helped the hours pass in a comfortable rhythm. In the mornings, she brewed a cup of coffee and listened to the local radio station while reading the newspaper from front to back, the same habit she had kept since the 1980s. In the afternoons, she sometimes volunteered at the public library, helping children find books or teaching them how to pronounce difficult words, just as she had done for decades in her classroom. And in the evenings, if the weather allowed it, she walked through Grant Park, watching the city lights flicker on as offices emptied and traffic softened into a steady, distant hum. Those walks were often the quiet highlight of her day because they reminded her that even though her own life had slowed down, the world around her was still full of motion and possibility. Tonight, however, the wind cut deeper than usual, and the snow on the ground glowed pale under the streetlights, as if the entire park had been frozen in place. Margaret shifted slightly on the bench and tucked her hands into the sleeves of her coat before glancing once more toward the man seated at the far end. He had not moved much since sitting down, except for the occasional rubbing of his hands together, and the longer she watched, the more she noticed how thin his coat really was for a night like this. In Chicago winters, people learned quickly which clothing could withstand the cold and which could not, and it was obvious that the stranger beside her had come out into the night wearing something that belonged to a much warmer season. Margaret lowered her gaze again toward the snow dusting the ground near her boots and felt the familiar tug of concern that had followed her through most of her life, because after spending 4 decades looking after children, it was difficult to ignore someone who looked uncomfortable or forgotten, even if that someone was a grown man sitting quietly at the other end of a frozen bench. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully climbed above the maple trees behind the house. For 42 years, my mornings had followed the same quiet rhythm. Coffee first, then the slow walk through the kitchen while the house was still half asleep. But that morning something felt different. The air carried a strange heaviness, the kind that settles in your chest when your heart already knows a truth your mind is still trying to ignore. I stood by the kitchen window holding my coffee mug and watched the pale light spread across the backyard that my late husband and I had planted together decades ago. Every rose bush had a memory attached to it. Every stone along the garden path had been placed by our own hands. This house was never just a building to me. It was the map of my entire life. The laughter of my son Daniel as a boy still echoed in these walls if you listened carefully enough. But the conversation I had overheard the night before refused to leave my thoughts. Chloe's voice had been calm, almost casual, when she spoke about things that did not belong to her. The house, the accounts, the future. She spoke as if the story of my life had already reached its final chapter, and someone else was preparing to close the book. I told myself I needed proof before allowing suspicion to poison my heart. So instead of sitting down with my crossword puzzle like every other morning, I walked to the small office at the end of the hallway. The same office where my husband used to balance the checkbook every Sunday evening. The wooden desk still carried faint scratches from the calculator he used for years. I turned on the lamp and opened the folder where I kept the household documents. Insurance statements, property taxes, bank letters. Everything was always carefully organized. That was how my husband had taught me to live. Order meant security. But when I opened the newest envelope from the bank, my fingers suddenly grew cold. There was in plain black ink a request for information about transferring ownership structures connected to the property. The wording was polite and professional, but the meaning was impossible to misunderstand. Someone had already begun asking questions about changing who controlled this house, and the request had not come from me. My eyes slowly moved across the page until they reached the name listed under the inquiry authorization. Chloe Parker, my daughter-in-law. For a long moment, I simply sat there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hallway. I realized then that what I heard the night before had not been careless conversation. It had been planning, careful planning. And the most painful part was not the document in my hand. It was the sudden understanding that my own son must have known about it. Daniel had grown up inside this house. I had stayed awake through fevers and broken hearts and school troubles. I had stood in the rain cheering at his little league games and saved every crooked drawing he brought home from kindergarten. Yet somehow the woman who married him now believed she could quietly move the pieces of my life without me noticing. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back inside the envelope. A strange calm began to replace the hurt rising in my chest. If Chloe believed I was simply an old woman waiting politely at the edge of the story, she had made a serious mistake, because I was not finished writing my chapter yet. After I placed the envelope back into the folder, I sat quietly at the desk for several minutes and allowed the silence of the house to settle around me. My husband used to say that the truth often reveals itself when a person stops reacting and starts observing. That morning I decided I would do exactly that. Instead of confronting anyone or allowing anger to guide my actions, I would simply watch carefully and listen closely. The rest of the house slowly began to wake as the morning moved forward. I heard footsteps upstairs and the familiar sound of kitchen cabinets opening. Chloe was the first to come downstairs, dressed neatly as always, her voice cheerful in the way people often sound when they believe everything is going exactly according to their plan. She greeted me with the same polite smile she had worn for years, asking if I had slept well and if I wanted more coffee. I returned the smile just as calmly and told her I had slept perfectly. There was a strange moment as she poured herself a cup, because for the first time I noticed how carefully she watched my face while pretending not to. It was the kind of look someone gives when they are checking whether a secret is still safe. Daniel came down a few minutes later, tying his tie while glancing at the clock on the microwave. He kissed Chloe on the cheek and gave me a quick hug before reaching for a piece of toast. Everything looked so ordinary that a stranger would have believed this was simply another peaceful morning inside a comfortable American home. But once you know where to look, the smallest details begin to tell their own story. Daniel avoided meeting my eyes for more than a second. Chloe kept guiding the conversation toward practical matters about the house, repairs, insurance, long-term planning. At one point, she casually mentioned how complicated property ownership could become for older homeowners and how important it was for families to plan transitions early. Her tone sounded helpful and concerned, but the timing of those words was too perfect to be accidental. I nodded slowly and listened as if I were hearing these thoughts for the first time. Inside my mind, however, the pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a very clear picture. They believed that patience would eventually place everything into their hands. They believed that time itself was on their side. When Daniel finished breakfast, he grabbed his car keys and rushed toward the door, apologizing that he was already running 10 minutes late for work. Chloe followed him to the front porch to say goodbye, and I watched them through the kitchen window as they spoke quietly beside the car. The distance was too far for me to hear their words, but Chloe's expression changed the moment Daniel got into the driver's seat. Her polite smile faded and was replaced by a look of quiet calculation. It was the face of someone who believed she was slowly moving closer to a goal. When she returned inside the house, she found me calmly rinsing my coffee mug in the sink. She asked if I had any plans for the afternoon, and I told her I might drive into town to run a few errands. That part was true, but what I did not say was that one of those errands would change the direction of this entire story. Because if someone had already begun asking questions about the ownership of my home, then it was time for me to start asking a few questions of my own. The room grew quieter after the uncomfortable laughter faded, and for the first time that evening I noticed how several relatives avoided looking directly at me. It was not the kind of silence that follows a joke. It was the silence people keep when they realize something unpleasant has just been revealed. I folded my hands gently on the edge of the dining table and let my eyes travel slowly around the room, not with anger, but with a calm patience that only many decades of life can teach. Across from me, Melissa shifted in her chair and forced a polite smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. My son Daniel cleared his throat and reached for his water glass, even though it was already empty. I understood then that the conversation earlier was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan, and for a long time I had simply been the last person in the family to recognize it. I thought about the house around us, the same house where I had spent 38 years raising children, fixing broken cabinets, baking birthday cakes, and staying awake through countless nights when someone in this family needed me. Every corner of this place carried a memory, yet suddenly I felt like a visitor sitting at my own table. Still, I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. Instead, I asked a simple question in a steady tone that surprised even me. I asked Daniel if he remembered the summer when he was 12 years old, and we repainted the entire living room together because he wanted the walls to look like the houses he saw on television. He nodded slowly, confused about why I mentioned it. I reminded him that we worked 3 full days in the July heat, measuring every wall, moving every piece of furniture, and laughing whenever we spilled paint on the floor. That memory softened his expression for a moment, but Melissa interrupted quickly, saying that memories were nice, yet the conversation tonight was about practical matters. She spoke carefully, as if she believed calm words could hide sharp intentions. I watched her for a few seconds and realized something important. She believed that because I was older I would remain quiet, grateful, and easily persuaded. Many people assume age makes a woman fragile, but what it truly gives her is clarity. I leaned back slightly in my chair and said that practical matters were exactly why I had spent the past few weeks reviewing certain documents and speaking with a few professionals in town. Daniel looked up immediately. Melissa's smile faded just enough for me to notice. I did not explain everything yet. I simply told them that when a person lives long enough, she learns to prepare for surprises, especially inside her own family. The words hung in the air between us, gentle but firm, and for the first time that evening I could see uncertainty spreading across the faces that once believed they understood exactly how this story would unfold. Daniel's fingers tightened around the empty glass as if he suddenly realized it had been in his hand the entire time. Melissa glanced toward him quickly, then back at me, measuring every word I had just spoken. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her polite expression. She had expected confusion from me, maybe hesitation, maybe even quiet agreement. What she had not expected was preparation. I let the silence settle for a moment longer because silence has a way of making people reveal their true thoughts without saying anything at all. Finally, Daniel asked what I meant when I said I had spoken with professionals in town. His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to sound casual while feeling deeply uneasy. I smiled softly, not with satisfaction, but with the calm patience that comes from many years of solving problems alone. I explained that after Harold passed away 3 years earlier, I realized how quickly life can change, especially for someone my age. I told them that I began organizing everything in a responsible way: the house, the property taxes, the savings account, even the small rental cabin near the lake that Harold and I bought decades ago for weekend fishing trips. Melissa's eyebrows lifted slightly at the mention of the cabin, and that reaction told me more than words ever could. I continued speaking slowly, so every sentence would be perfectly clear. I said that during the past month I had met with an attorney and a financial advisor to review my plans for the future. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical decisions made by a woman who understands her own life. Daniel shifted in his chair again and asked why I had not mentioned any of this earlier. I answered honestly. I told him that sometimes people reveal their intentions when they believe an older woman is not paying attention. A quiet room followed that statement. No one argued with it. I could see the tension building between my son and his wife now, the subtle glances they exchanged when they thought I might not notice. For years I had been the one smoothing over disagreements in this family, the one who believed patience could fix anything. Tonight, I realized patience does not always mean silence. I rested my hands gently on the table and told them something very simple. I said that when a person spends her entire life building a home, raising children, and protecting her family, she eventually learns to protect herself as well. My voice stayed calm and even, the way it does when you are certain about the truth you are speaking. Melissa opened her mouth as if she wanted to respond, but she hesitated for the first time since the evening began. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had not seen in years, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty, as if he was suddenly remembering that the woman sitting across from him had once been the one guiding every important decision in his life. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse anyone of anything. Instead, I reached beside my chair and lifted a thin folder that I had quietly placed there before dinner began. I set it gently on the table between us. The sound of the paper touching the wood was soft, but in that moment it carried the weight of something much larger than any argument. The room had grown quiet after the papers were placed on the dining table, and for the first time that evening I noticed how the afternoon light fell across the hardwood floor that I had polished with my own hands for nearly 20 years. Daniel stood near the window with his arms folded, avoiding my eyes, while Melissa kept adjusting the bracelet on her wrist as if the metal were suddenly too heavy for her. I did not raise my voice. At my age, A calm tone often carries more weight than anger ever could. I gently slid the folder toward them and watched as Daniel finally reached for it. Inside were copies of bank statements, property records, and the letter from the attorney that had been prepared weeks earlier. I had suspected something was wrong long before that uncomfortable dinner invitation arrived. A mother knows when her home begins to feel unfamiliar. For months I had noticed small things that did not add up. Bills redirected to a different mailing address. A conversation that stopped the moment I walked into the kitchen. A whisper between Melissa and the real estate agent during what was supposed to be a simple family barbecue. They believed I was too old to notice the details, but age sharpens observation in ways youth rarely understands. Daniel slowly turned the pages, and I saw the moment realization reached him. The house could not be transferred. The savings account could not be accessed. The legal authority they believed they had quietly arranged no longer existed. Weeks earlier, after the first uneasy feeling settled in my chest, I had visited my lawyer and changed every document connected to my estate. The property was now placed in a living trust managed by an independent attorney. My financial accounts required my direct approval for any transaction. Even the title to the house had been updated. Melissa finally spoke, but her voice had lost the confident tone she used earlier that evening. She asked why I would do something so extreme. I looked at her calmly and explained that protecting what you built is not extreme. It is responsible. For 40 years I worked double shifts, raised a child, paid every mortgage payment on time, and hosted every holiday dinner in this house. Respect is the one thing I expected. In return, silence filled the room again, heavier than before. Daniel looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his own decisions had finally settled on his shoulders. I stood up slowly and gathered the empty coffee cups from the table, the same way I had done after hundreds of family dinners before this one. But tonight felt different. The illusion had disappeared, and in its place was something clearer and stronger. They had believed this evening would end with signatures and quiet control over everything I owned. Instead, it ended with understanding. I was still the woman who built this home, and I was still fully capable of deciding what happened within its walls. Daniel remained seated at the table long after he finished reading the last page inside the folder. The quiet in the room had changed again, no longer tense, but heavy with the kind of realization that cannot easily be undone. Melissa looked from him to me, as if she were searching for a way to return the evening to what she had expected earlier. But there are moments in life when a path closes completely, and no words can reopen it. I walked slowly to the sink and rinsed the coffee cups, listening to the sound of the water run steadily while I collected my thoughts. After a few minutes, Daniel finally spoke, his voice softer than I had heard it in years. He asked when I had made all these changes. I dried my hands with a kitchen towel and turned toward him. I told him it happened about 6 weeks earlier, on a quiet Tuesday morning when I sat at my small breakfast table with a cup of tea and realized that something inside my own home no longer felt honest. I explained that the attorney had been very patient while I reorganized everything. The trust was established, the property records were updated, and a neutral financial manager was assigned to oversee the accounts if anything ever happened to me. I also told him something that made Melissa shift in her chair. The trust included clear instructions about the future of the house. The property would remain under my control for the rest of my life, and after that it would not automatically pass to any one person. Instead, it would be sold and the funds distributed between several family members and 2 charities that had been important to me for many years. Daniel looked surprised by that part, and I could see the questions forming in his mind. I explained calmly that fairness often requires distance. When emotions and expectations grow tangled, sometimes the best decision is the one that removes temptation altogether. Melissa tried to respond by saying they had only wanted to help manage things as I got older, but her explanation sounded thin even to her own ears. I did not argue with her. Instead, I simply nodded and said that real help always begins with honesty. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the quiet minutes that followed. I gathered the remaining plates from the table and placed them beside the sink, continuing my small routine as if it were any other evening. Yet inside I felt a surprising calm. The uncertainty that had followed me for months was finally gone. Daniel eventually stood up and walked slowly toward the door, pausing as though he wanted to say something more, but could not quite find the words. When he left the room, Melissa followed a few steps behind him, and the front door closed with a soft sound that echoed through the hallway. I remained standing in the kitchen for a moment, looking around at the familiar cabinets, the old clock above the stove, and the framed photographs along the wall. Every corner of this house held pieces of my life. That truth had never changed, and tonight I had simply reminded everyone else of it. The room grew quiet in a way that I had not heard in many years, the kind of silence that makes every small movement sound louder than it truly is. I slowly folded my hands on the table and looked from one face to another, taking my time as if I were studying a photograph that I might never see again. For decades, I had believed that patience was the strongest thing a mother could give her family. I believed that kindness would eventually be returned. But that evening I understood something different. Patience without boundaries only teaches people how far they can push you. My son avoided my eyes. My daughter-in-law kept her chin lifted with the same polite smile she had used earlier when she suggested that it might be better for everyone if I moved into a small apartment across town. She spoke as if it were generosity, as if the home I had paid for over 30 years was suddenly a place where I no longer belonged. I let the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to settle around the table like a heavy blanket. Then I reached into my purse and placed a thin envelope beside my plate. The paper made a soft sound against the wood surface. That small sound finally made my son look up. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. Instead, I spoke slowly and clearly, the same way I used to read bedtime stories when my children were young. I explained that during the past few months I had taken the time to review every document connected to the house, the savings accounts, and the land that my late husband and I had purchased together outside the city nearly 20 years earlier. I explained that I had also spoken with an attorney and a financial advisor. Their expressions changed before I even finished the sentence. My daughter-in-law shifted in her chair, and the confident smile she had worn all evening began to fade. I slid the envelope across the table, but kept one finger resting on it. Not as a threat, simply as a reminder that this conversation now belonged to me. Inside the envelope was a copy of the new legal arrangement that would take effect at the end of the month. The house would no longer be transferred automatically through family expectation or casual promises whispered during holidays. Instead, it had been placed into a living trust managed by a professional trustee. The property, the land, and the remaining investments would be used first to support my care and independence for as long as I lived. After that, the assets would be distributed to several charities that focused on housing support for widows and older women who had been pushed aside by their own families. I watched the realization move slowly across their faces. No shouting followed. No dramatic confrontation filled the room. What arrived instead was something much heavier. Understanding. For the first time in many years, they realized that the quiet woman they had underestimated was no longer asking for permission to remain in her own life. I leaned back gently in my chair and let them absorb the truth. The decision had already been made long before this dinner began, and for the first time in a very long while I felt a calm kind of freedom settle into my chest.